Hi guys. Sorry for the long wait for the second episode. I have been busy with work and my laptop completely gave out on me, but fortunately I am able to finish this chapter. I hope you guys like it. Standing at the sandy beach, he stares in determination at the offending rusty oven in front of him. He could feel his quirk coursing through his veins, spreading warmth throughout his tiny body before bursting towards his back and head. His white shirt immediately burns off his body while his blue shorts ruffles from the sudden gust of wind that appears from the eruption of his wings. He could feel a pair of dark green eyes bore into him, watching his every move or lack thereof. A bead of sweat rolls down his forehead, nervousness grip his form from the expecting stare he was receiving, but he shook it off. He did it in front her many times after all. He wills his quirk to the directions of his palms, creating small streams of emerald fire that started to swirl, slowly condensing into a ball the size of a tennis ball. A smile appears in his face as he watched the small ball started growing in mass until it becomes the size of a basketball. A primal roar erupts from his throat as he ready himself to throw the ball of fire into the deadly villain that was the fridge. With the fury of a god he throws his power towards the inanimate object. As soon as it made contact, a huge explosion engulfs the fridge, incinerating it in seconds, leaving only a pile of ash in its wake. A satisfied smile blooms on his face before it evolves into a loud victorious laugh, mimicking All Might's iconic laugh. How long are you going to stare at your hands, Izuku? The questioning voice of Shiozaki reaches his ears, breaking him out of his imagination. Flushing in embarrassment, he turns his sight towards Shiozaki, who was looking at him as she tried to extend her vines to wrap around a coffee maker machine but failed as she was unable to extend her quirk long enough for her to do what she wanted. I still can't get it to extend enough to even reach it, Shiozaki said, groaning in frustration before flopping down the sand to sit and glare at the innocent coffee maker before redirecting it towards Izuku. It's your fault, you know, Shiozaki said, confusing the young aspiring hero. If you haven't shown off your wings I would have been able to focus on my training, Shiozaki said as a cute pout made itself on her face. Izuku could still remember the first time Shiozaki saw him activate his quirk, making the vine-haired girl look at him as if he was some sort of otherworldly being, and how many times she pestered him to activate his quirk every time he wasn't using it. Although he got annoyed after her seventh request, he still obliged to it as his mother told him to look at it as endurance training. Tilting his head in confusion, he made his way towards the girl who stares at him mesmerized at his quirk. How is that my fault? Izuku asks, deactivating his quirk as he plops down beside Shiozaki. Because it is. You keep distracting me for no reason, Shiozaki countered. How is that my fault? I am just practicing my quirk same as you, Izuku stated, grabbing a handful of sand, his face is scrunching as he tries to think of the reason of her being distracted. His eyes widen in fear before he turns his head towards the girl sitting beside him. I didn't hit you with my quirk, did I? Izuku asks in worry, checking her for any signs of injuries. He sighs in relief as he sees no injuries other than those she received from Bakugo and his posse. You didn't hit me in the slightest, Shiozaki said as she closed her eyes and clasping her hands together. For the good Lord is protecting me with his love, she stated as a beam of light shines down on her. Izuku jumps back, startled at the sudden appearance of the light. He looks up to the sky and sees no source it could have originated from. He shook his head in disbelief at the scene in front of him. Even after 3 days of meeting Shiozaki, he still couldn't get used to her personal light beam. Seriously, how are you doing that? Izuku asks, staring at the slowly vanishing light. Doing what exactly? Shiozaki asks as she looks up, trying to see what Izuku was staring at. You've been asking me the same question for the past 3 days, Shiozaki continued. But that's because, you know what, never mind. But back at my fist question. How am I distracting you? Izuku asks, sitting back down beside Shiozaki, who look away from him. Izuku noticed look at her in confusion, wondering what she was looking at. He looked at the directions that she was looking at but sees nothing. It was then when he noticed a pinkish hue dusting her face. He opened his mouth to ask why her face was red but was cut off when he heard a loud growl, startling the two of them. Seeing a way out from his question, Shiozaki quickly got up and suggested that it was time for them to have lunch as she dragged a flustered Izuku whose stomach won't stop grumbling for nourishment. Izuku could feel his face heat up even more as he looks at their joined hands as they make their way towards their parents, who were waving at them to come over to their location. Unbeknownst to him, the girl in front of him was sporting a blush on her own, accompanied by a content smile on her face. 3 sets of eyes watch the 2 small figures approach their location, said owners of those two sets of eyes watch in glee as they saw the blushing faces of their kids. Unfortunately, the last sets of eyes twitch in agitation as he glared at the joined hands of the two green-haired kids. Hearing her husband grumble something under his breath, Magdalene Ibarra looked to her side and laughed in amusement as she see the look on her husband's face. "What's with the sour face, dear?" Magdalene asks, putting a hand on her husband's shoulder, a grin making its way on her face as she already knows the reason for her husband's mood. A scowl appears in his face as he turns his sight to his wife, whose grin turns into a teasing smile as she playfully jabs his sides, trying to force a laugh out of him. Unfortunately for her, Crisostomo Ibarra's facial muscle didn't change as he continued to glare at the conjoined hands of the two children. "It's impure for them to be already doing that," Crisostomo complained. "I taught her better than that. I taught her to be proper." He continued, earning an eye roll from his wife. "They're only children, dear. There is no harm from them holding hands, you're thinking too much of it," Magdalene said before turning towards Inko, who was in the verge of tears seeing her son with a cute girl she already see as a potential love interest for her son. "And besides, we think that they look adorable, don't we, Inko?" Inko didn't answer but merely nodded as she watched the children approach them. "How goes your training, dearies?" Magdalene asks as the two children stood in front of them with Shiozaki looking back and forth between her parents while Izuku gasped as he noticed his mother in the verge of tears. "It went fine, mother. Thank you for asking," Shiozaki replied with a bow. Crisostomo gives a simple nods at his daughter's answer as Magdalene merely pats Shiozaki on the head, wincing a bit as her hands got stabbed by the tiny thorns on her daughter's head. "Mom, did something happen? Why are you crying?" Izuku frantically asked while being in the verge of crying himself. The three Shiozakis watch the scene from the side with varying reactions, still not being used to what they dub as the Midoriya's secondary quirk. After having their fill, the two children decided to once again practice with their quirks, but instead of doing individual training they decided to do a sparring match between them, much to their parents' disapprovals, who quickly shuts down the idea as being too dangerous for their well-being. But after multiple attempts of persuading their respective parents to approve of their sparring match, the two were delighted when their parents finally relented and agreed with their idea on the condition that they use their quirks on the minimal and with their parents supervising the spar from the side. Standing in the middle of a clearing, the two children stare at each other. Although the match has already began, the two combatants continue to remain in their respective spots, waiting for the other one to make a move. The two remained silent a bit longer before the dam finally broke when Izuku bolted straight towards his opponent, who extends her hair in anticipation for an attack. Without missing a beat he activated his quirk, turning his newly donned on white shirt to burn away as his emerald wings erupted from his back in all its glory. His hair and eyes combust with the same fire, quickly making Izuku resembles an archangel descending for battle. Seeing his quirk, a pair of dark green eyes stares at her approaching opponent, mystified at the sight before her. She stared in awe at the boy's quirk, her hair retracting slowly as she slowly lost focus on what she was doing in the first place. Fortunately for she was able to break out of trance in time as she barely dodged a small fireball that whizzed past her head. With a yelp she landed on her back before scrambling to get up and defend herself as she see Izuku throwing another fireball towards her directions. Managing to get up, she mentally orders her hair to extend past the length they normally could and form a barrier in front of her, and unlike the times she do so, she's only able to extend it to a length that reaches the small of her back. She growled in frustration as she received another failed attempt before shaking her head in the effort to forget about her recent failure. It was then when an idea came into her mind. An idea that she surely gets her an earful from her parents after the match, but she decided to worry about it later, as of right now she is in her first real fight where she is actually trying to defeat her opponent, not like the last time with Blonde and his goons where she was trying to buy time for the bullied kid to escape. Without a moment of hesitation, she bolted from her position and extends her hair to its max length just past her shoulder. Seeing that she wasn't stationary anymore, Izuku quickly formed another fireball in both his hand before chucking it towards the quickly approaching girl. Although he was able to slow her down by dodging his attacks, it didn't stop his opponent from trying to reach him. Seeing the nearly arm's length distance between them, Izuku extinguishes the fires in his hands before dropping down into a fighting stance, preparing himself for a close-quarter combat. Expecting a hand or foot, Izuku's eyes widen in a fraction of a second when Shiozaki, whom he thought was throwing a punch when he see her pulling her arm back for an attack, decided to leap upward and spins her body into the air. Not expecting her move, Izuku didn't realize what she was trying to do until a swat of her hair his cheek sending him tumbling down the sand. Grunting in pain, he quickly pushed himself up from the ground, barely dodging the second spinning attack from his friend. Although being hit by the unorthodox attack, he tries to stifle a laugh when he sees his friend barely able to stand up from the ridiculous attack she just executed. What made you think that was a good plan to do, Shiozaki? Izuku said, sporting a childish grin as he approached the barely standing girl. Because now you won't be able to defend yourself from me, he exclaimed while copying All Might's signature laugh. Too busy acting as All Might, Izuku didn't realize the vine encroaching his ankles. His laughter immediately stops when he felt it wrap itself around him, stopping him from using his feet. With a hard yank of her quirk, Izuku quickly finds himself landing on his back in a heap. He struggles to break away from her hold, but having a hard time as every move made seems to make her tighten her grasps on him. Fortunately for him, due to Shiozaki's inability to further the length of her quirk, she continued to lie on the ground, unable to stand up. The three adults on the side stood still as they watched their children both struggle on the ground. Inko watched in worry as her continues to try and fail at escaping his opponent. Magdalene watched the match in earnest, not taking her eyes away from the two combatants, cheering them on both. Meanwhile, Chrysostomo on the other hand watches the match conflicted, relief that her daughter was able to dodge Izuku's attacks but feel a bit peeved seeing her daughter roll on the ground like a feral child. Izuku winces in pain as her hold got even tighter. Unfortunately for him, Shiozaki didn't seem to notice his state as she was having difficulties looking towards him as her quirk limits her from looking up. He forces himself to prop himself by the elbow. Now in a sitting position, he grabs holds of the vines on his ankles but quickly regretted his action as he felt the thorns on her hair prick his skin, causing him to immediately let go of her hair. Although he knows he can form a fireball on his hands to force her to let go of him, he decided to abandon that idea, not wanting to throw his quirk towards her face at point-blank range. A plan? I need a plan, any plan as long as it doesn't involve her being hurt too much. Come on, Izuku, think. What would All Might do if he is in the same situation? Izuku frantically thought as he struggles to push himself out of her hold. He winces in pain again from her ever-tightening constrictions. Panic starts to bloom in his mind as he continued to fail to come up with a plan to escape as the pain from his tied-up ankles make it hard to form a decent plan. Surrender, Izuku, Shiozaki said, closing her eyes, trying to avoid the flying sands that threatens to make contact with her eyes. There is no shame in admitting defeat, Shiozaki continued, confident that she can make her opponent yield. Izuku could hear her mother agreed with her, urging him to surrender to avoid him getting hurt even further. Unbeknownst to him, the flames on his body flutters like a candle being threatened to be put out by a gust of wind. Although not as prideful as his former best friend, Izuku's pride took a blow at the prospect of him losing his first fight. He always imagined that he would win his first fight, mopping the floor with his enemies like All Might always did. As time progresses, his fire got smaller and smaller as he slowly starts to lose his will on continuing the fight. And before he knows it, his fire fully extinguishes itself, leaving him in his base form. Although Shiozaki started to lessen her hold on Izuku, he failed to notice it, too preoccupied at the thought of losing in his spar. Now standing, Shiozaki stared at Izuku, who remained unresponsive after she tried calling his names 3 times. Worry gnaws inside her as he continued to lay there with a faraway look in his eyes. Kneeling beside him, she shook her friend, urging him to respond, but after a few tries he still didn't move. Not knowing what to do, she turned towards to the side and looked at the directions of the adults. Mama, I thinks there is something wrong with Izuku, she shouted with fear evident in her voice. It didn't take long before the 3 adults hastily went towards her with Inko leading the 3. Suddenly she hear a murmur reaches her ears, forcing her to turn her gaze towards Izuku, who was quietly uttering words she couldn't understand. Her eyes widened before she found herself taking a step back as she Izuku's quirk activating again. Seeing her step away from Izuku, the 3 adults stops in their tracks, wondering why Shiozaki was stepping away from Izuku. It didn't take long for them to get their answer when they notice Izuku's quirk burst to life. Although Izuku's quirk was strong enough to push her to the ground due to their proximity, she was fortunately spared from any harm. Once settled, the 4 stares at the large bonfire at where Izuku was. Not a second passed and a stream of fire fly towards the sky, sending poor Shiozaki to fall on the sand once again after dusting herself off the ground. 4 pair of eyes squinted at the sky, trying to see what burst out of the fire. It was then they noticed the familiar figure of Izuku inside the flying fireball that kept flying in a circle above Shiozaki. A large satisfied smile remained in his face and feel it would continue to grow even bigger if he continued to go even faster. A bit satisfied from his newly gained flight, Izuku stopped mid-air and looked down below. His eyes made contact with Shiozaki's, whose eyes reflect awe and wonder, but it didn't take long before it morphed into something he can't figure out. But before he could dwell more on it, he heard his mother call his name. Turning his head towards her direction, she could see the worry in her face as she stared at him. "Look, Mom, I finally did it. I can fly now," Izuku said as he excitedly shouted to his mom as he once again fly in circles. Like any excited child, Izuku barely registered her calls to fly lower and slower. Joyful laughter reaches Shiozaki's ears as she glared at the flying boy above her. A feeling of wonder and awe bubbles inside her as she continued to stare at her friend. It wasn't long before it was replaced by envy the longer she looked at him flying freely in the sky, not anchored to the ground like her, whose quirk keep her grounded. Shiozaki. Shiozaki. She was startled out of her thoughts when she heard Izuku call out to her. Deep in her reverie, she didn't realize Izuku was now in front of her, just hovering above the sandy ground, his wings picking up sand, causing her to cough as she accidentally inhaled a bit of dust. Sorry about that, Shiozaki. I should have deactivated my quirk first," Izuku said apologetically as he watched his friend continue coughing. His concern was quickly replaced by excitement again as a wide grin appears in his face while he pointed over his shoulder, showing her his wings. "But look at this, Shiozaki. I can fly now. I can finally use them. I don't know how I do it, but it feels like I am just using another set of arms." Unbeknownst to him, he didn't notice the frown growing on Shiozaki's face as he rambles on about how amazing his quirk is. "I don't want to fight anymore, Izuku. Let's call it day," Shiozaki suddenly said, quickly halting Izuku, forcing him to stare at her for a second, processing the words she had just said. "What? Why?" Izuku asks as he landed on the ground, deactivating his quirk in the process. His eyes follow the retreating form of his friend, who started making his way towards the adults. Not missing a beat, he quickly jogged beside her with concern evident on his face. "Are you okay, Shiozaki? Did something happen?" Izuku asks, making Shiozaki shook her head but not saying a word, confusing him in the process. "Then why? Or are you hungry? Is that why you want to stop our fight?" Izuku asks. Shiozaki shook her head. "No, it's not that, it's just that I am," she stated, but stops herself as she see the look her friend, who was patiently waiting for her explanation. "Not really in the mood to spar anymore, Izuku, if you could call us rolling on the ground sparring," she said as she dusted the dust clinging to her clothes. "But you still haven't answered my question. Why stop our fight just when you were kicking my butt?" Izuku said as he performed a kick, sending sand in the air and landing in their face. The two children coughed, trying to push out the dusts that have gotten inside their mouths. Shiozaki glared at Izuku, who in return gave her an apologetic grin. "Sorry," Izuku said simply. "I would have kicked your butt for this if I wasn't already doing it earlier," Shiozaki stated as she walked ahead of Izuku. "Then why stop?" Izuku asks again, earning a tired sigh from Shiozaki. "I just don't want to continue, okay? I am tired and just want to rest a bit," Shiozaki said with finality, leaving no room for more questions from her friend. The rest of the day went by with them no longer continuing their spar, much to Izuku's dismay, leaving them train their quirk separately, in which Shiozaki tried her hardest to extend the length of her quirk while occasionally getting distracted by Izuku, who relishes his newfound flight ability. And every time she see him took flight, a scowl would appear on her face as she concentrated on her own training. The day ended with the two family returned to their own homes. Izuku watched in awe as he stared at the moving image of his idol inside the television. "Izuku." He heard his mother calling him from the kitchen. "Dinner is ready, sweetie, time to get off the television." Although he heard her clearly, Izuku remained in his spot, not taking off his gaze away from the television. As he continued to watch the show in front of him, he imagined an older version of him using his quirk, fighting side by side with All Might, fighting the evil doers around them. Still lost in his imagination, he swerved away from an attack and dished out multiple attacks on his opponents, leaving them lying on the ground unconscious. A proud smile appeared in his face as he alongside All Might continued to dish out justice to their enemies. But it didn't take long for his imagination to turn south as his surroundings become different, much darker than it originally started. He deactivated his quirk as he noticed no enemies in his vicinity as attacking but standing still looking up in the dark sky above them with a blank look on their face. But his curiosity rose that not only the villains have stopped attacking him as he noticed that All Might has suddenly vanished from thin air. He walked through the still villains, he tapped one in the shoulder but the figure didn't respond and continued to stare blankly at the void above. As he continued to walk past his enemies, he started noticing that all of his enemies share something in common with one another, and that is that all of them have a mutant quirk. As he trekked deeper through the mass of people, they start to display less human-like figure and instead show animalistic features that correspond with their quirks. Suddenly he heard a voice called his name, forcing him to look around the battlefield to spot the origin of the voice. His eyes widen in shock when his gaze landed on the familiar figure of his friend, except that she, like himself, is much older. As he walks towards her, he noticed that she was wearing a white robe, her hair have become longer, reaching the small of her back. He opened his mouth to call to his friend but no words would come out. As he got closer to the older Shiozaki, the sound of the splashing water reaches his ears, forcing him to stop walking and turned his gaze towards the ground where he see the area was flooded with some sort of liquid he couldn't identify. He turned his gaze back to Shiozaki, who has her eyes closed, with her hand clasped together, muttering words he couldn't understand. With each steps he make towards her, red liquid starts to appear on her, dripping towards the liquid that they are both standing in. He watches the water around them quickly become dark. Dipping his finger on the water, his eyes widen in horror as he realized that the water didn't just change color but turn into an ocean of blood. His heart starts beating wildly in his chest as he look around and see the villains around him have blood oozing out of their eyes and mouth, chanting words he couldn't understand as their voice become louder and louder. Horror grips his being as the people surrounding him slowly turn their gaze towards him before slowly walking towards him with their bodies contorting unnaturally. With each steps the sound of bones breaking reaches his ears. He tried closing his eyes to block the image in front of him, but to his horror, he could still see them approaching him. Their voices becoming louder and louder as they got closer towards. He puts his hands on his ears in an effort to block out their voices but flinch when he felt something cold touches his skin. He opened his eyes and it was here that he noticed that he was wearing some sort of armor that looks familiar to him, but he couldn't put a finger on where he has saw it. In the corner of his eyes he noticed his reflection on the ocean of blood. His quirk fully activated in all its glory. His fire burned brightly, quickly boiling the blood around him. He felt himself flinch when he heard their chants transform into screams of agony. He nearly vomited his insides as he see the people around him started burning with green fire, their skins slowly melting from the fire, showing their flesh and bones to his fear-filled eyes. Amidst the screams of agony around him, he heard her voice, sending a calming feeling through his body. He turned towards the figure of his friend who remained unmoving and undisturbed from what was happening around them. He willed his legs to move towards her. But as he got closer to her, he noticed them started running towards him. He could feel his heart drop when their mangled hands nearly grab hold of him. He ran as fast as he could towards her friend who continued to stand motionless through the commotions. Looking over his shoulder, he see the burning mangled bodies gave chase towards him, screaming bloody murder. Their voice grew louder and louder until he could feel their breath reeked with death boring down the back of his neck. Although avoiding their hold, a single touch from them, he could feel his strength ebbing away from him, his fire grew weaker and weaker with each contact them make with his skin. As he drew closer and closer towards Shiozaki, he could finally clearly hear what she was saying. A name. She was uttering a name that sounds foreign to him. Reaching out a hands towards her, he tired calling out to her, but like before no sound escapes his mouth. And as if noticing his presence, she outstretched her hand towards his. The moment their skin made contact with each other, everything around him disappear. The voice, the bodies, everything vanish in an instant. He looked around him and breathed a sigh of relief before facing towards Shiozaki, who unlike before has finally opened her eyes and was now looking at him with sadness in her eyes. What happened to you, Izuku? Her voice filled sadness. Why did you do it? Why did you commit those heinous acts? She asked him. He tried answering her but no words would come out. What would your mother say when she see you what you have become? You are not him, you are Izuku Midoriya, please resist him. Don't turn into the monster he tried to make you to be. He racked his brain trying to figure out who this him she was talking about but came up blank. Izuku. She said once again. Izuku. He tilted his head in confusion, wondering why she keep repeating his name even though she got his undivided attention. Izuku, Wake up. Startled, he took a step back when her voice becomes distorted as if she was talking to him underwater. Izuku, please wake up. It was then her voice morphed into someone he clearly knows. The voice of his mother. In the blink of an eye he find himself once again sitting in front of their television, different from what he was originally watching. He looked to his left and was greeted by his mother looking at him in worry. What happened? He asks. Where is Shiozaki? He continued. Shiozaki isn't here, Izuku. She's back home with her parents, remember? Inko replied. But I don't remember what I was about to say. Izuku said, making Inko look at her child in concern. What happened, Izuku? You were staring blankly ahead, not responding to any of my calls. Inko asks. Izuku's face scrunches in concentration, trying to recollect what happened earlier but came up blank. I can't remember, Izuku replied. The two remained silent for a moment before Inko told him that he should rest and that maybe he was just tired from his training earlier. Unbeknownst to the two across the street from their apartment, two cloaked figures could be seen observing the mother and child. The two figures look at each other and nod at one another before disappearing to the night. This is it for the second episode of Heaven's Fire. I hope that you guys like it. Leave a like, comment and subscribe, I really appreciate it. Thank you and have a nice day.